This video asks a deliberately narrow question. What happens if we set the New Testament aside and look at the evidence outside it? We are going to follow Roman, Jewish, pagan, archaeological, and non-canonical Christian sources. The goal is not to smuggle faith into history. The goal is to see what history itself refuses to let us dismiss. I want to remove the easy answer. For this presentation, the New Testament is not our witness box. We are asking what survives in sources outside the biblical canon. Enemies, bureaucrats, historians, satirists, archaeology, and early Christian writings that were never placed in the New Testament. This is the discipline of the deck. We are not going to treat every ancient sentence as equal. We will ask when it was written, who wrote it, what their attitude was, and exactly what it can establish. Most bad apologetics happens when a source is asked to prove more than it actually says. There is one important distinction. Non-biblical does not always mean non-Christian. I will clearly label Christian sources outside the New Testament and hostile or neutral sources outside Christianity. That way we never pretend Clement or Ignatius were neutral observers. Their value is their early date and what they show Christians were already proclaiming. Notice the pattern. Josephus is writing by the early 90s. Clement is writing around the same broad generation. By the early 2nd century, Roman administrators and historians are talking about Christians and Christ. Then pagan critics begin attacking the resurrection itself. The evidence gets later as we move out, but it does not suddenly appear in the 4th century. By the end of this video, these are the 3 levels I want you to keep separate. First, Jesus as a historical person. Second, his execution. Third, the resurrection claim. Not merely that Christians eventually believed in heaven, but that specific post-death appearances and rising from the dead were already being asserted and attacked. Before we touch the writers, we start with dirt and stone. Archaeology will not give us a photograph of Jesus. What it can do is show that the people, offices, burial customs, and crucifixion practices attached to the story belong to the real 1st century world. This is the Pilate stone, discovered at Caesarea. The surviving Latin names Pontius Pilate and calls him prefect of Judea. That matters because Pilate is not floating in Christian literature alone. He is a 1st century Roman official, literally set in stone. This does not prove the trial of Jesus, but it locks the political setting to history. Sources: Israel Museum, collection record for the Pontius Pilate inscription, dated 2636 CE. The Caiaphas ossuary is another historical anchor. It bears the family name and has been identified by the Israel Museum with the high priestly figure of the period. I am intentionally not overusing it. The point is simpler. The names and institutions tied to the Jesus narrative belong to a recoverable 1st century Jerusalem world. Sources: Israel Museum, exhibition record for the ossuary of Caiaphas. Roman crucifixion is not an abstraction. A heel bone from 1st century Jerusalem still contains the nail that pinned the victim to the wood. This is not Jesus. It does something different. It gives us physical evidence that this method of execution was being used on Jewish victims in the place and period under discussion. Sources: Israel Museum object record via Google Arts and Culture for the Yehohanan ossuary and heel bone. This is the line that keeps the argument honest. Archaeology gives us the stage, but archaeology by itself has not handed us an artifact that says Jesus of Nazareth was here. For direct textual evidence about Jesus, we now move to Josephus and the Roman writers. Josephus is the first major external writer we need to slow down for. He was Jewish, lived through the Jewish War, moved in elite circles, and wrote his Antiquities in the early 90s. He contains 2 passages relevant to Jesus, but they are not equally secure. Josephus gives us 2 different evidentiary questions. Antiquities Book 20 contains the James reference, which is generally treated as much less problematic. Book 18 contains the famous Testimonium Flavianum, whose exact wording has been debated for centuries. We should never flatten those 2 passages into one. This is one of the cleanest non-Christian references to Jesus. Josephus is explaining which James he means. His identifier is essentially James, the brother of Jesus, the one called Christ. Jesus is not the main character in the paragraph. He is the reference point Josephus expects to identify James by. Sources: Josephus, Antiquities 20.200. Oxford Academic, T.C. Schmidt, Appendix on the James passage. Incidental evidence is often better than a speech written to persuade. Josephus needs to distinguish this James from other men named James, so he identifies him through Jesus. That does not tell us the resurrection happened, but it makes the idea that Jesus was simply invented later much harder to sustain. Sources: Josephus, Antiquities 20.200. Scholarly discussion in Oxford Academic. This is where apologetic presentations often overreach. The received text of Josephus contains very Christian-sounding lines, including a 3rd-day appearance. Those lines have serious textual questions around them. There are modern scholars who defend more of the passage than others, but for our case, we do not need to pretend the resurrection sentence is secure. I want this slide in the video because it makes the rest of the case stronger. If we take every disputed line and shout proof, viewers who know the scholarship stop listening. So we are not using the resurrection clause in Josephus as our foundation. We will find a much cleaner way to show that the resurrection was being proclaimed and directly attacked outside the New Testament. So Josephus gets us to an important historical floor. Jesus is a first-century reference point in a non-Christian Jewish historian. That alone is damaging to mythicist claims. But now we move to Rome, where the evidence for execution and the spread of the movement becomes even more direct. The Roman sources are valuable because they are not trying to make Christianity look good. In fact, their language is hostile. That hostility means their references cannot easily be dismissed as Christian self-promotion. Tacitus is one of the strongest non-Christian sources in this presentation. He is not sympathetic. He is explaining Nero's treatment of Christians after the fire of Rome, and in doing so he gives a compact origin story for the movement. Tacitus says the name Christians came from Christus, that Christus received the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius, and that the movement then re-emerged in Judea and reached Rome. He does not tell us Jesus rose. What he does give us is an unfriendly Roman confirmation of a founder, an execution, a governor, a reign, a place, and a movement that survived its founder's death. Sources: Tacitus, Annals 15.44, Perseus Digital Library. A person can reject Christianity and still have to deal with Tacitus. He is not repeating a devotional sermon. He is describing a despised movement under Nero. His brief explanation of its origin aligns with the basic historical frame: Christ, Pilate, Tiberius, Judea, execution, and rapid survival of the movement. Pliny is not writing history. He is doing administration. He has Christians in front of him, he does not know exactly how to handle them, and he writes to Emperor Trajan for instructions. The testimony he extracts is revealing. These people meet before dawn and sing to Christ as to a god. Sources: Pliny the Younger, letters 10.96 to 97. Pliny does not tell us why the Christians believed Christ was divine. He does show that the movement was organized, ethically self-conscious, and intensely Christ-centered by the early 2nd century. The worship of Christ is not a medieval innovation. It is already visible to a Roman governor. Suetonius gives us 2 notices. The Crestus line under Claudius is ambiguous, and we should label it that way. The Nero passage is cleaner. Christians are a known group that received punishment. Together with Tacitus and Pliny, the Roman world is clearly aware of this movement very early. This is where the cumulative case matters. Tacitus, Pliny, and Suetonius are not one source copying one Christian sermon. They are different Roman writers with different purposes. Their combined picture is a movement centered on Christ, traceable to Judea, associated with an executed founder, already present enough to create problems for Roman government. Now we widen the lens. These sources are not all as strong or early as Tacitus and Josephus. Some are ambiguous. Some survive through later manuscripts or Christian rebuttals. Their value is not that each one proves everything. Their value is that Jesus and his movement keep appearing in sources that do not share Christian belief. Mara talks about the killing of the wise king of the Jews and says his teaching or laws lived on. Many scholars understand the figure as Jesus, but because the date and identification are less secure, this is supporting evidence, not a pillar. Notice again that we are grading evidence, not collecting every possible reference as if it were equal. Lucian is openly making fun of Christians. That is exactly why he is useful. He knows them as people who worship or revere a man crucified in Palestine and who live by the laws of that founder. Again, not resurrection proof, but an external pagan memory of the crucified founder and the devotion surrounding him. The Talmud is not a first-century newspaper. The Babylonian compilation is much later, and scholars debate how early its Jesus traditions really are. But the tradition is hostile, not Christian, and it remembers a Jesus the Nazarene who was executed around Passover, treated as secondary corroboration, not the cornerstone. This is an important pattern. The hostile sources do not generally argue that Christians invented a person who never existed. They attack what he was, what his followers believed, or what his death meant. That does not prove every Christian claim. It does tell us the debate in antiquity was usually over interpretation, not bare existence. Now we reach the question that matters most. Can we show, without quoting the New Testament as evidence, that the resurrection was being talked about? Yes. The clean historical claim is not that a pagan eyewitness saw Jesus rise. The clean claim is that resurrection was a defined, early Christian proclamation, and that a pagan critic directly engaged and attacked the appearance stories. Clement is Christian, So he is not neutral evidence that the miracle occurred. His value is chronological. By the 90s, a Christian document outside the New Testament can refer to God raising Jesus from the dead as a shared premise. The resurrection is not appearing for the first time centuries later. Ignatius is especially interesting because he is already fighting an internal alternative explanation. He insists Jesus truly suffered and truly rose, not merely seemed to suffer. That tells us the debate is already about the nature of the death and resurrection, not whether there ever was a Jesus. Quadratus goes further and says people healed or raised by Jesus lived for a long time, even into his own era. We have to qualify this heavily. The text survives as a fragment quoted by Eusebius, and Quadratus is a Christian apologist. So I am not calling it independent proof. I am showing the boldness and specificity of the public claims circulating in the early 2nd century. Celsus is the crucial hostile witness for the resurrection discussion. His own book is lost, so we know it through Origen's lengthy answer. That means we must be transparent about transmission. But Origen quotes and paraphrases enough of Celsus that we can see what the pagan critic was attacking, and it includes the resurrection appearances. This is the point the video is building toward. Celsus asks who saw the risen Jesus. He mocks the female witness, attacks the other claimed witnesses, and offers explanations such as hallucination, wishful thinking, or deception. That is not a pagan confirmation that Jesus rose. It is pagan confirmation that by the 2nd century, the resurrection claim was specific, public, and concrete enough to be attacked point by point. This is the honest payoff. Celsus does not prove the resurrection. What he proves is that a hostile pagan was not dealing with a vague spirit lives on idea. He was dealing with claimed post-death appearances and arguing against them. By his time, the debate is already resurrection versus alternative explanations. This matrix is the discipline of the whole argument. No single source does everything. Josephus is strong for existence. Tacitus is strong for execution. Pliny is strong for worship. Clement and Ignatius show early non-biblical resurrection proclamation. Celsus shows hostile engagement with the resurrection appearances. The case is cumulative because the sources do different jobs. This is the historical case at its strongest and cleanest. The external record does not let us reduce Jesus to a late legend. It gives us a founder, a Roman execution, a persistent movement, early worship, explicit non-biblical resurrection proclamation, and then hostile pagan engagement with that proclamation. A historian cannot rerun Easter morning, but that does not mean history has nothing to say. History can tell us what claims existed, how early they existed, whether enemies knew them, whether alternative explanations were proposed, and what happened to the movement afterward. The final inference is a worldview-level judgment about what best explains those facts. I want the strongest skeptic in the room to feel represented. The serious skeptical case is not usually Rome and Josephus accidentally documented a fictional character. It is that Jesus existed, died, and his followers had experiences or developed traditions that they interpreted as resurrection. Once we get there, the debate is no longer existence versus myth. It is explanation versus explanation. This is the cumulative conclusion. The external evidence is more than enough to establish that Jesus belongs to history and that his execution belongs to history. The resurrection itself remains an inference, but the resurrection claim is early, explicit outside the New Testament, and important enough that a pagan critic attacks the alleged appearances. That is a far stronger historical position than Christianity invented all of this centuries later. The challenge at the end is simple. You do not have to become a Christian because an ancient Roman historian wrote a paragraph. But you also do not get to dismiss Jesus as a character who drifted into history centuries later. The man is there. The cross is there. The movement is there. The resurrection claim is there, and even its enemies had to answer it. The final question is yours. What explanation is big enough for the evidence?